In 1985, A View to a Kill premiered in theaters and did respectfully well at the box office, but it was obvious at that point that Roger Moore was getting a little long in the tooth to continue playing James Bond. Cubby Broccoli had to find himself another actor to fill Roger Moore's shoes, and many actors were given screen tests. Some of the finalists included Anthony Hamilton, an Australian model who was playing a spy on a show called Cover Up, Finlay Light, and finally Sam Neill, who got a screen test and apparently was one of the frontrunners to take the part. Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli were very interested in hiring him, but Cubby Broccoli didn't go for it. They eventually ended up settling on Pierce Brosnan, who was wrapping up his run on Remington Steele at the time. But fate had other ideas. Even though Brosnan had aced his screen test and indeed was hired to play the part, just as they were about to announce the fact that he had signed on, NBC decided to greenlight Remington Steele for another season. Now, what they thought was that they'd be able to parlay the notoriety that Brosnan would get from his James Bond movies into higher ratings for Remington Steele, but they didn't count on the fact that Cubby Broccoli was not interested in having Pierce Brosnan split his time between Remington Steele and James Bond. He famously said, "Remington Steele will not be James Bond, and James Bond will not be Remington Steele." This ended up costing Pierce Brosnan the part, and in fact his co-star Stephanie Zimbalist also lost out on a really famous role. She was supposed to play Officer Lewis in RoboCop, but had to step down when Remington Steele got another season. And to add insult to injury, NBC actually ended up canceling the series after just a few more episodes. Pierce Brosnan would struggle over the next few years to find meaningful roles, and indeed would be at something of a low ebb when his career was kind of revitalized by movies like The Lawnmower Man and Mrs. Doubtfire, and of course his time would eventually come as James Bond in Goldeneye. But that era is not upon us, not quite yet. When Pierce Brosnan wasn't able to play James Bond, they actually went to an actor that had been their first choice all along, apparently. Timothy Dalton was an actor that Cubby Broccoli had always had his eye on. In fact, he was approached to take over the role of James Bond in 1971 in Diamonds Are Forever, but he was only in his early 20s at the time and was far too young, or at least that's what Dalton thought. He was approached again before Octopussy and again before View to a Kill, but each time he was busy, and in fact wouldn't have been able to do Living Daylights because he was off filming the movie Brenda Starr with Brooke Shields. It's crazy that Brenda Starr, a movie that ended up going direct to video something like 4 years later, almost cost Timothy Dalton the role of James Bond. Crazy. And finally they had themselves a James Bond. He was a Shakespearean actor, and the film was tailored to suit him, meaning that he would pull on a darker approach to the character, one that was a lot more serious than Roger Moore's. But the question remained, how would audiences react to this dark new direction? To give this Bond movie the edge that it needed, John Glenn, who had directed the 3 previous installments, was carried over and seemed good at making these kind of grounded James Bond movies, and in fact would be more grounded in Living Daylights than he had been since For Your Eyes Only. John Barry returned to score the film, as did Desmond Llewellyn as Q and Robert Brown, who was playing the new M at the time, or at least had been since Octopussy. One James Bond veteran, though, that did not get to continue her role was Lois Maxwell, who had to leave the role of Miss Moneypenny and was replaced by Carolyn Bliss, to have an actress, I suppose, that was more in line, age-wise, with Timothy Dalton. The film was a classy production, with Mariam Dabo signing on to play the love interest while Yaron Krabbe and Joe Don Baker played the villains. In the movie, a recently defected KGB agent is kidnapped and Bond is called in to investigate, leading him to a plot involving the Russian war in Afghanistan and a multi-billion-dollar opium smuggling operation. A much more serious premise than you'd gotten in James Bond films for quite some time. Now, Timothy Dalton really gets a bad rap as James Bond. Everybody loves Daniel Craig and his new darker Bond, but nobody ever gives Dalton any credit for basically taking the same approach 20 years before Craig ever slipped on his tux. Now, to be sure, The Living Daylights is nowhere near as dark as what would be Dalton's follow-up film, License to Kill, which is, I think, the movie that everybody kind of remembers him for. And that's a lot grittier than any James Bond movie that came before or would come after. This one is kind of a halfway point between the Roger Moore James Bond movies and the darker Dalton James Bond movies. It had a pretty topical plot for the moment, involving Glasnost, the end of the Cold War, and the war on drugs, plus the Russian war in Afghanistan. Nowadays, the film doesn't get a ton of play for similar reasons to Rambo 3, as it involves Bond teaming up with the Mujahideen, which eventually gave way to a radical splinter group, the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. Still, however, one needs to consider the era this film was made in, and it's a real shame that The Living Daylights has kind of been forgotten by people, as it's actually a rock-solid James Bond movie, albeit with a more earthbound approach than anyone had seen in a Bond movie for quite some time. There's a lot to recommend here with some really great action scenes and a couple of good hand-to-hand scraps, plus it's got a tight pace and a more involving than usual plot, plus a surprisingly nice romance between James Bond and his leading lady, which from all accounts was something of a reaction to the ongoing AIDS crisis. You see, people in that era just had less of a taste for James Bond jumping into bed with every woman he saw when safe sex was all over the headlines. This is what I consider a real sleeper film for the franchise, and as far as I'm concerned, it's one that's ripe for rediscovery. In fact, when I was a kid, this was one of my favorite James Bond movies of all time. I vividly remember seeing it on Easter Sunday, 1990, when it made its world premiere on the ABC Sunday Night Movie. I was so excited to see this movie that apparently I woke up at 4 a.m. to watch my recorded version off of VHS and called my best friend at the time to let him know, hey, I taped the new James Bond movie. Unfortunately, it was 4 a.m. and I didn't quite respect the fact that his parents would probably be sleeping, and that got me into a little bit of trouble. But hey, you know what? I still love this movie. Love it dearly. Now, let's break it down a little bit. The plot is kind of complicated, although I think that it was pretty solid in that they really tried to make this a gritty, grounded Bond movie. It has a lot of kind of double crosses and has a little bit in common with John le Carré. In this one, they really try to drive home the fact that James Bond is a seasoned professional who's kind of getting sick of his job. He doesn't want to kill his leading lady at the beginning, Kara, who he thinks is a KGB sniper. As he says in the film, he only kills professionals, and she was no professional.
I only kill professionals. The girl didn't know one end of a rifle from the other.
You really get a feeling that Bond is getting sick of his job, even telling a fellow agent at one point that M could stuff his orders.
You deliberately missed. Your orders were to kill that sniper.
Stuff my orders.
This was kind of a precursor to the next film, in which James Bond would famously resign from the Secret Service. And I really kind of like this road they were going down with Timothy Dalton, where James Bond is just getting sick of it all. It's terrific, and they kind of picked up on that a little bit with Daniel Craig, I think. So the script is probably about a 7 on 10 because the only place where it really fails is that the villains aren't as memorable as they should have been. However, as far as James Bond goes, I have to say Dalton does a pretty solid job in his first James Bond outing. Being a Welshman, he brings a lot of gravitas to the role, and I enjoyed his grittier but still suave take on Bond. My only issue with the movie is that there's a few scenes where Dalton feels like he's maybe trying too hard to be serious as Bond and seems uncomfortable with some of the comedy. In fact, Dalton always seems kind of uncomfortable when he's in a tuxedo and seems to be enjoying himself more when he's adopting the casual James Bond look, when he's wearing a leather jacket or running around the city doing action scenes. In fact, I'd say the movie really gets good once he gets to Afghanistan and it becomes kind of more of a typical action movie of the era. Dalton seemed very comfortable in action films, but playing the suave side of James Bond is not something I think he was extremely well suited for, pun intended. However, I'd still give him an 8 on 10 because I like Dalton a lot. The villains, however, are a bit problematic. While I like this film, they were kind of weak. Jeroen Krabbe as Koskov was probably the main villain, but he's not the least bit threatening. He's so likable. He's got this smile on his face throughout the movie. He's so likable, in fact, they don't even kill him off at the end. They just kind of let him go. He gets arrested, but he'll probably be okay. Joe Don Baker is the more threatening one, with him playing Brad Whitaker, an arms dealer, but he has pretty much no screen time. He has 3 scenes. That's about it. So he's not really a primary villain. So Koskov is, by all accounts, the main villain, and he's a weak one. We do have Andreas Winiarski as Necros, the KGB assassin stalking Bond throughout, but he's really more of a henchman than a true villain. But he's got a couple of really wicked fight scenes, and he looks amazing. I mean, this guy was really built, and is definitely a worthy foe to James Bond. My problem with his part, though, is that it's very obvious he was looped for the role, and does indeed look a little bit too much like a European male model, which he actually was. I mean, there's a scene where he's kind of like lounging around in a skimpy bathing suit, which, seems like it was plucked off of a Playgirl calendar. If you recognize Winiarski, by the way, he was also Alexander Goodenoug's brother in Die Hard.
Drop it, dickhead. It's the police.
And he's also shown up in a couple of the Mission Impossible movies as one of Max's associates. I give the villains about a 6 on 10. The Bond girl, Mariam Dabo, as Kira Malovi, I like quite a bit. She plays a Russian cellist who gets totally suckered in by Jeroen Krabbe's Koskov. She falls in love with him, he uses her. She gets a lot of screen time, and she's quite likable and endearing, and has nice chemistry with Timothy Dalton. I'd give her about an 8 on 10. The Bond music in this one is terrific. John Barry is back and he provides a solid James Bond score. Now, in a concession to the era, there's a lot of synthesizers being used on the soundtrack, which is something that they had never really done before in the Bond franchise. But John Barry kind of makes it work. It's definitely a very 80s sounding score, much more than any other scores that he wrote for the series, but I really like it and it plays really well. The action scenes are quite exciting and at times it almost sounds like a Rambo movie. I really like it. The theme song, also very 80s, is by Norwegian one-hit wonders a-ha. Yes, a-ha, the guys who did Take On Me. I kind of like a-ha. Their live acoustic performance of Take On Me that came out and made the rounds of YouTube a couple of years ago is really, really good. I mean, these guys are talented, but apparently John Barry had a really, really lousy time working with them. So much so that he actually decided to retire from the series after this movie. So, I don't know, maybe it wasn't just a-ha, but John Barry didn't seem very happy when this was over. And indeed, this would be his swan song for James Bond, but luckily, it's a pretty good score. I give it about a 9 on 10. Now, as it's Timothy Dalton and they're trying to make him a more serious James Bond, he's a lot less randy in this film. He only actually really hooks up with one woman in the film. Mariam Dubbo is Cara Malovy. Although you do get the feeling that maybe following the teaser at the beginning of the movie, he's going to hook up with that hot lady on the yacht.
Won't you join me?
Better make that 2.
He has some good one-liners though, and there's a really cool fight scene where they're hanging on a cargo net, him and Necros, that's full of opium. He eventually gains the upper hand, and when the villain is left hanging onto his boot for dear life, he proceeds to slowly cut the shoelaces in a cold-blooded moment that's amongst the toughest in the series. The villain falls to his death, and when he returns to the cockpit, Hera asks what happened, to which Bond perfectly replies,
He got the boot.
In the way of gadgets, there's not a lot here because, again, they were trying to make it a much more serious Bond movie. But he's got a beautiful car.
Just taking the Aston Martin out for a quick spin, Q.
Be careful, 007. It's just had a new coat of paint.
And a nifty little keychain that releases stun gas when you whistle into it.
Stun gas.
Now, the movie was relatively successful when it opened at the box office. People seem to think that Timothy Dalton's movies were disastrous, but actually The Living Daylights was kind of a hit, pulling in about $50 million in the US, which was about the same as what A View to a Kill had made a couple of years earlier, and it made $140 million worldwide off of a $30 million budget, which was very profitable, enough so that they decided to continue with Timothy Dalton. Again, I really enjoy this movie. I think it's a super solid James Bond movie, and it's got a ton of really good action scenes. I especially love the teaser, how they kind of set up these different actors that look like past James Bonds to potentially be our new James Bond, only to pull this heroic reveal of Timothy Dalton climbing a cliff while the agents are being killed. It's really good, and it ends up culminating in a really cool fight scene where he's fighting a KGB assassin on top of a truck that's loaded with explosives. It's really cool and just one of the many awesome action scenes in this movie, including a really cool car chase, even though it gets bogged down a little bit in the gadgets and seems a little silly for Timothy Dalton, to be completely honest. I really enjoy this movie. It's one that I watched over and over and over again as a kid, so I give it a strong 9 on 10, although I will admit that some of that may be nostalgic value. Of course, things would take a much darker turn for Timothy Dalton in his next go-round as James Bond, but we'll get to that in the next installment, as that's a story for another time. Thank you for watching James Bond Revisited. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our channel, tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support. When Timothy Dalton's first outing as James Bond, The Living Daylights, came out in the summer of 1987, it was a financial success, but a modest one. Audiences were not flocking to James Bond films in the way they used to. The formula needed to be shaken up because Bond was getting beaten at the box office by a new wave of action films. Kids were now going to see stuff like Die Hard, Lethal Weapon, Predator, Rambo. They were racking in the kind of dough that the James Bond movies when Sean Connery was playing Bond used to rack in back in the 60s. Obviously, the Bond producers wanted to cash in on this new hardcore action trend, and the decision was made to make the next James Bond installment the grittiest and most violent entry in the series' history. In fact, to this day, I'd still say License to to Kill is by far the most violent James Bond film. Now, in this one, Timothy Dalton's James Bond is out for revenge when his best buddy from the CIA, Felix Leiter, played by David Hedison, the only man to ever play Felix Leiter twice, he first played him in Live and Let Die, is attacked by an evil drug lord named Sanchez, played by the great Robert Davi. Felix Leiter is left badly mauled, by sharks no less, missing a leg, while his wife Della is murdered. Bond, with it reminding him of his own wife being killed, of course, goes on the warpath, vowing to kill the Colombian drug lord that's responsible for the attack. Now, License to Kill is by far the most controversial James Bond movie ever made. In fact, a lot of people really didn't like this one when it came out. It was panned because people said it wasn't really a James Bond movie. People said it was a lot like a Joel Silver movie or a Miami Vice episode. And sure, it was definitely more timely in that way. And I remember being blown away by it somewhat when I was a kid because it seemed so much harder edged and violent, much more contemporary than the other James Bond movies, which always feel kind of somewhat timeless. I think License to Kill in some ways is probably the result of the Broccoli family and Michael G. Wilson having watched a whole bunch of Joel Silver action movies. Every frame of this film screams late 80s action flick, from the Michael Kamen score to the violent action sequences to the Colombian drug dealer villain that was ripped from the headlines. Heck, it even has an 80s style bar fight that looks like it came out of Roadhouse.
Oh, shit! Fight!
James Bond in a bar. I mean, that's just strange to me.
Touché.
Now, despite the fact that this is very controversial for James Bond fans, and it was a movie that a lot of them didn't like back in the 80s, it has really ratcheted up quite a cult following in the years since, and I have to say, I really like License to Kill. Just like his other entry, Living Daylights, it's an underrated flick. In fact, I'd wager that Timothy Dalton is probably the most consistent James Bond actor ever because both of his movies are really good. Now, the film isn't especially faithful to the established formula of the franchise. Michael G. Wilson co-wrote the script with Richard Maibaum, and actually would be Richard Maibaum's last time working on a Bond movie, and it really does kind of feel like an 80s action flick. James Bond even quits the Secret Service in a scene that blew my mind as a kid.
Then you have my resignation, sir.
We're not a country club, 007.
That said, it's probably more faithful to the character than people think. In the Ian Fleming novels, James Bond was a lot more rough-edged than he ever was in the films, and a lot of the most violent incidents in the film are right out of Fleming. Felix Leiter being fed to sharks was actually taken out of Live and Let Die, the novel. It was too violent, so they didn't use it in the 1970s. I feel that Timothy Dalton was really a devotee of the Ian Fleming books and played him as kind of this tired, worn-out British secret agent. Daniel Craig has kind of come close to what Dalton was doing in terms of darkness, but I really do think that Dalton played him in a way that was utterly unique.
A farewell to arms.
The film is really kind of split up into two halves. The first half of the movie is probably where it's the most quintessentially 80s, with James Bond out for revenge, putting together leads, doing a little bit of detective work, which is rare for a Bond movie, and, getting into kind of 80s staples of action films, getting into bar fights and all that, and meeting up with the tough but sassy love interest, Carrie Lowell's Pam Bouvier, who I absolutely adore. It's strange seeing kind of Timothy Dalton walking around in America because most of the film is set in Miami, and I also found that the cut of his suits is really weird in this movie. I think that Timothy Dalton never really felt comfortable in formal wear, so they were trying to make him a little bit more cash, and some of the cuts on his jackets and the blazers that he uses and the kind of the loose structuring of some of the suits kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I watched it again recently because it doesn't feel especially James Bond-like. I think he probably could have taken a couple of fashion tips from Don Johnson as Sonny Crockett if we're talking about killing some bad guys in Miami.
Surf's up, pal.
The first half of the film, though, is probably where it's at its best as Bond starts to investigate one of Sanchez's associates, Milton Crest, played by Anthony Zerbe. At this point, another of Bond's friends, Sharky, who's kind of a Quarrel-esque character and played by another 80s action mainstay, Frank McRae, is killed by some of Crest's henchmen. Once Bond sees Sharky's lifeless body, he flies into a blind rage, and in one of the most badass sequences in the franchise's history, calmly takes a harpoon gun, walks up to the man responsible, and shoots the guy point blank in the chest, telling him,
Compliments of Sharky.
pretty badass for a James Bond movie. And in fact, there's a rough cut of the movie that's out there on the internet where Bond actually starts laughing maniacally after he kills the guy, which I think probably would have taken things a little too far. It's pretty awesome stuff, but the film slows down a little bit once they hit Mexico City and Bond starts infiltrating Sanchez's cartel, with Michael G. Wilson on the Blu-ray saying he was always inspired by A Fistful of Dollars and Yojimbo, in the fact that Bond is playing one side against the other. It's a little bit more Bond-esque, I think, in this way, because it's more of a glamorous location. Bond's wearing tuxedos more, and even Q shows up. But luckily, Q actually gets a much larger role than usual, with him also going AWOL from the Secret Service in order to help Bond out on his mission.
Really, 007?
Q, what the hell are you doing here? I might have killed you.
Well, I'm on leave. Thought I'd pop round and see how you're getting on.
Awesome stuff, and I have to say, I always did find that Q loved Bond, and I think the relationship between him and Timothy Dalton's Bond was probably the warmest of everyone, except for maybe Roger Moore and Desmond Llewellyn, who are actually good friends in real life. Now, Timothy Dalton as Bond does a really good job, and it's such a pity that he never got a third film, as I really think he would have won more people over had he been given a little bit more time. Both of his films are so good, although everyone seems to enjoy beating up on the guy due to the fact that his films didn't exactly break box office records and his tenure as the character was very short. I'd love to see Dalton make kind of a serious comeback. He came pretty close with Penny Dreadful and certainly hasn't been wanting for work. He was in Hot Fuzz as a great villain. He was Mr. Pricklepants in the Toy Story series, and he's on Doom Patrol. He's in his 60s now, and I could really kind of see him growing into this kind of supporting character in a Brian Cox type mold. In fact, I think he even kind of looks like Brian Cox now. Really love Timothy Dalton. I think his performance as Bond in this film is spectacular. I'd give it about a 9 on 10. The only reason I don't give it a 10 on 10 is that it's not super Bond-like, I think, when we think of the traditional film version of the character. Still, I really like him in this movie, and I wish he'd gotten a third film. They came pretty close with this movie called Property of a Lady, but maybe it was best that it didn't get made, because apparently at one point Bond was supposed to fight a robotic henchwoman. I mean, Bond meets the Terminator. It might have been a little too much. The villain in this movie, really good. Robert Davi kind of rubs me a little bit the wrong way these days with some of his political statements, but man, he was a good villain. He plays Sanchez. Sanchez is a drug lord in the Pablo Escobar mode, and I really like that Davi doesn't kind of play him as a raving lunatic like some of the other Bond villains. It's actually believable that the charismatic, somewhat personable Sanchez could inspire loyalty from his men and build an empire. The only time he really ever loses it is when he tries to get his girlfriend back, Talisa Soto's Lupe, who keeps leaving him over and over again because he's a monster. There's a really brutal scene where he whips her, which is extremely violent for a movie that ended up going out as a PG-13, and I'm surprised. He has a mean, sadistic streak, which you see over and over again in the film, but for the most part, Sanchez is cool and laid back, and I think he kind of wants to be James Bond's friend in certain ways. Him and Dalton have really good chemistry. I also really enjoy seeing a young Benicio del Toro as Sanchez's right-hand man, Dario, and man, is his death scene ever brutal. There are, of course, a couple of minor villains in this film, with Don Stroud playing Heller and Everett McGill as Felix Leiter's CIA friend who betrays him and gets a brutal killing from James Bond. Killifer tries to bribe Bond, doesn't work out very well. And then you also get Anthony Zerbe as Milton Crest, who, again, has also another brutal death scene. I'm actually shocked at how violent this movie was, although the version that I was watching recently is the version that's out in Blu-ray and digital, which apparently is actually the R-rated version of the movie. You see, when it was submitted to the MPAA, it was slapped with an R rating, and they cut it down to a PG-13, and that's the version that came out in theaters. But when they were remastering it in 4K, they decided to go with the more violent version, which is something that's never really been talked about too much. Anyway, the villains in this movie, to me, are some of the best ever in the Bond series, so I give them a 10 on 10. Again, also, the Bond girls in this movie are so good. Talisa Soto is beautiful as Lupe, who's kind of Sanchez's squeeze and starts to fall for Bond, but the one who really steals the show is Carrie Lowell as one of the toughest Bond girls of all time, an ex-CIA pilot named Pam Bouvier. She's smoking hot, and in many ways, her tough-as-nails action heroine was ahead of her time. Bouvier is the type of character I could see somebody like Angelina Jolie or Charlize Theron playing. Carrie Lowell is so beautiful in this film, but man, does she ever look good with short hair. She looks good with long hair, but as soon as there's that scene, that reveal when she shows up with a smoking hot short haircut and Bond does a double take, whew, good stuff. I give the Bond girls in this one another 10 on 10. The Bond music is a bit more of a mixed bag. You see, John Barry quit the franchise just after Living Daylights, so they got Michael Kamen, who had scored Die Hard and the Lethal Weapon series, in to provide the music. He was, again, the quintessential 80s action movie composer, and his score is good. It's really good, it's just not super Bond-like. He does use the James Bond theme quite a bit, but you almost expect Eric Clapton to come in and start playing the James Bond theme. And in fact, Eric Clapton apparently did do a cover of the James Bond theme that's never seen the light of day. It's a good action movie score and it suits the movie like a glove. It's not super James Bond-like, but I still like it. The theme song by Gladys Knight, not bad. License to Kill. I mean, it must have been hard to write a song called License to Kill. Noteworthy, the closing song, If I Asked You To, which is written by Diane Warren and sung by Patti LaBelle, became a massive hit some years later when Celine Dion covered it. I'll give it an 8 on 10. A 008 on 10. In terms of Bond one-liners, there aren't really that many in this film because Bond is very serious. The only time he kind of cracks wise at all is when, he gets revenge for Sharky or when he kills Killifer. But even then, it's more of a cold-blooded one-liner than an actual haha funny one-liner. It's also pretty short on double entendres. I think the movie was a little bit more politically correct than some other James Bond installments. Things had changed a bit by the late 80s, and the film is definitely a reflection of its time. There are some good gadgets, however, because, like I said earlier, Desmond Llewellyn has a major supporting role in this film as Q, and actually gets to work a bit in the field. He gives him an awesome signature gun that can only be fired by him, and was the first time I'd ever heard of the concept. There's also a camera that shoots lasers and for some reason takes X-ray photos. I didn't really care for that one too much. Oh yeah, and then Q has a rake that's also a walkie-talkie. And I guess in the 80s that was cool. Now, it has to be said, this film was not a box office hit, at least not North America. It was hampered by the fact that it had some of the most boring trailers you can imagine. I mean, they really did not sell this movie well.
Problem solved. I'm more of a problem eliminator.
I feel like everybody involved was just kind of coasting and expecting it to do well just because it was a James Bond movie. And boy, what a mistake did they make, because it came out in the summer of 1989, which has gone down in history as sequel summer. This was the summer that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade started things off with a bang, and then Lethal Weapon 2 came out and was a huge hit, and you had a little movie called Batman that totally took the air out of the box office, and there was Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, there was Roadhouse, there was all kinds of huge movies, and James Bond just couldn't keep up. It was even outgrossed by Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, which everybody always says is the worst film in the series.
Piss off.
License to Kill made an anemic $33 million domestically, which was a disaster for a James Bond movie considering how much it cost. Although worldwide it was a pretty big hit. It made $156 million, which was actually above what The Living Daylights made, but North America is such a huge market for James Bond movies, it couldn't help but be seen as some kind of major disappointment, and I think that's probably why we never got a third Timothy Dalton film. Although, again, like I said, they came pretty close. I've always thought this was one of the best James Bond movies, even though it's very divisive, so give it a strong 8 on 10. Of course, this was the end of the Timothy Dalton era, a premature end if I do say so myself, but we were about to embark on an all-new era. Unfortunately, it would take a long time to get there, 6 years, before we'd finally get Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, the role that he came so close to playing in 1987 when they went into production on The Living Daylights. But of course, that's a story for another time here on James Bond Revisited. Thank you for watching James Bond Revisited. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our channel, tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.